Welcome to the next lecture in the Understanding Security series. This week we're looking at food security. Usual disclaimer, as with all of the lectures in this series, this is not something that I recorded specifically for YouTube. This is a recording of a lecture that I gave recently to a live audience. So the quality may not be fantastic, but hopefully it will be adequate, and I hope that you find this useful. So this week we're on to food security. So obviously closely linked to last week's topic, which is water security. Obviously, no water, no food. One of the biggest uses of water, of course, being in agriculture. So food security, we could again define it in more than one way, as with most of the terms that we use, but one definition would be to say that food security exists when all people at all times have physical, social and economic access to sufficient, safe and nutritious food. Again, not just now, but going forward as well, the idea of this being sustainable. Food poverty can mean a lack of food, a lack of quantity of food, but it can also refer to a lack of quality food as well. Undernourishment describes basically a situation where people are either not getting enough to eat, or the calorific intake is providing less than their minimum energy requirements. We're going to talk about hunger targets and various kind of international initiatives which aim to address those. So again, we could look at it in human security terms. We can also look at it, of course, in national security terms, in traditional security terms, because food and the ability to deny food has been used as a weapon of war since time immemorial, through sanctions, through blockades, starve them out. How do you deal with a heavily fortified location if you don't have the forces to assault it? Well, you just surround it and starve them out. Standard operating procedure when besieging a medieval castle, for example. If we look at the Second World War, so obviously national security is one way to look at it, but of course obvious human security connotations as well. So we can think of various dimensions connected with food. Obviously the production of food in the first place, the processing of food to make it safe, to make it palatable, distribution, which very often is the big problem, distribution and access. It's not the production of food at a global level, which is lagging behind. It's the ability to distribute that food to those who most need it. Consumption of food and obviously waste of food as well. Huge amounts of food actually doesn't go feed anyone, it goes to waste. Now, food insecurity, again we've mentioned this multiple times previously last year. So acute food insecurity, 250 million people experiencing acute food insecurity, which has actually increased since COVID and since the pandemic. 2.3 billion others face moderate or severe food insecurity. So we're talking more than a quarter of the global population. Again, not necessarily starving, most of them, but not getting access to sufficient or sufficiently nutritious food to keep them healthy. It might be enough to keep them alive, but not enough to keep them in a good state of health. Approximately 35 million people estimated on the brink of famine. Over 500 million people, well over 500 million people, projected to be chronically undernourished by 2030, and the majority of those are in Africa. And in Africa in particular, the situation is actually getting worse largely because population is rising quite rapidly, but food availability and distribution so although the situation has got better in some parts of the world, particularly Asia and South America, that's not true in Africa. In fact, the situation in Africa is getting worse. In terms of children's health, I've quoted this figure numerous times. An estimated 5 million children every year die of malnutrition or starvation. That's just the kids. And indeed, about half of all child deaths globally are linked to malnutrition and therefore are potentially preventable. But even among those who survive, again, the health may be profoundly affected for life. So, for example, stunted growth. If you don't get adequate food in childhood, then you're never going to grow properly, which is obviously that's the crucial period in your life when growth takes place. So, it declined. It's declined recently. We're still talking almost a quarter, and that's a shocking figure. Almost a quarter of children, their growth is affected due to malnutrition. That's an incredible, it's a shocking thing. We've mentioned around 2.8 billion people not being able to afford a healthy diet. And again, as we've said before, as you're already aware, the problem isn't production, globally at least. The world does produce enough food to feed everyone adequately. It's not a shortage of food at a global level. Distribution and access to that food is the problem. And again, the number of people experiencing hunger is actually increasing, particularly in Africa. Most of that increase is in Africa. So, the worst affected countries, again, these are not the only countries that are severely affected. Some of the worst affected countries: Burundi, Chad, Madagascar, Somalia, South Sudan, and Yemen. So, what are the kind of most frequent causes of food insecurity, and particularly famine? Well, one problem is over-reliance on a single staple crop for survival. If the crop fails, for whatever reason, then if you don't have an alternative, then you've got a big problem. So rice, for example, is the staple crop in large parts of the world. And again, we're not just talking about crop failure, we're talking about the effects of free market capitalism, of neoliberalism. The use of land for export of cash crops, huge amounts of land owned globally, increasing amounts of land owned globally by conglomerates, by large companies who are going to use that land for the most profitable purpose, and that isn't necessarily providing food to the local population. Much more profit in growing tobacco, or in some cases opium, rather than feeding local populations. So again, we can link this back to the idea of rent-seeking behaviour. We can link this back to some of the critical perspectives, particularly those of you who did at UIR last year, which is most of you. You remember, the neo-Marxist stuff, you remember dependency theory, well, which is a, prime example of it. Of course, the effects of war as well. Very many famines are linked to conflict, whether that be interstate war or very often intrastate conflict. So again, heavy overlap there with from our previous topics. Again, inability or reluctance of the state to do anything about it. And again, very often it's not just governmental reluctance, it's governmental inabilities, it's weak states, failed states, natural disasters, droughts, floods. Again, many parts of the world living very precariously. You know, they may be okay so long as the harvest comes in that year, but it only takes one bad harvest and they've got real problems. And of course, you know, with climate change, changing weather patterns, that is potentially becoming more frequent. But also, again, coming back to, you know, the effects of capitalism, market distortions, we'll talk a bit about that as well. The supply chain, and again, this can affect even advanced economies. We're not necessarily just talking poor countries here. Disruptions to the global supply chain can have a huge impact. We in the UK are very, very vulnerable. You know, we've not really felt that vulnerability up until now. But actually, we import the majority of our food. If global trade were to break down, we would have a big, big problem in the UK. We cannot produce enough to feed even half the population. We are absolutely dependent on food imports and have been for many years. But as population grows and agricultural output in the UK actually declines, you know, that vulnerability gets worse. You know, and up until now, we've kind of been wealthy enough and we've kind of been able to, you know, import that food. We've been able to get hold of that food. But all it takes is a major disruption to global trade, global shipping, for example, and we've got a serious problem. And of course, it's not just import of food as well. It could also mean import of the things that you need to grow food. So that could be fuel. You know, modern agriculture, of course, is heavily dependent on machinery. No fuel, no tractors, no combine harvesters, no mechanised agriculture, or things like fertilisers. I mean, again, modern agriculture, which is not necessarily a good thing, but in terms of, you know, the kind of yields that are produced, only possible with chemical fertilisers. So if you have a problem getting access to those, then that's going to affect your ability to produce food. Things like pesticides and so on, or even, you know, hybrid or genetically modified seeds. And again, you know, all sorts of things can disrupt that, can disrupt those markets, included, not limited to, conflict. As the world increasingly urbanises, again, that brings new forms of food insecurity as well. You know, as people kind of move from rural areas to cities, then keeping, especially the kind of mega cities that are emerging today, keeping those huge concentrations of people supplied with food becomes an increasing logistical challenge. Of course, climate change, which we've mentioned, it's an increasing problem. Just how bad it will get, we don't really know yet. Again, different models produce different outcomes. You know that rainfall patterns change across much of the world, particularly across, you know, large parts of Africa, and you know, the potential for what was once fertile farmland to become desert, and the obvious repercussions of that. Not just in terms of hunger, but also the knock-on effects. The mass migration, which again, it has to, because, you know, if people are no longer able to subsist where they are, then they have to move. They don't have a choice. But also, you know, the potential for increased conflict. You know, fighting over limited resources. So again, lots of historical examples of famine, and, you know, in a sense, in sort of modern times, in advanced economies, we're living, you know, perhaps not as secure as we feel, but for a long time, you know, food supply is something that those of us that have kind of lived in wealthy, advanced economies, we've not had to worry about. You just go down to the supermarket and you buy it, there's no problem. But actually, for most of human history, that has not been the case. You know, most societies for most of history have been pretty precarious. One of the most famous examples, of course, which I'm sure most of you have heard of, the Irish potato famine in 1845 to 50, which, wiped out an estimated 1 million people in Ireland and forced another million to emigrate. Now, when you consider that the overall population of Ireland was only about 8 million, that's a quarter of the population that died or were forced to leave. And again, that came from various factors, but the key cause was over-reliance on one crop. The potato was kind of the main source of calories. But when a new disease came out called potato blight, which killed the crop, there wasn't an alternative. And again, we can also look at, the history around this is complex and it's still a political issue today, even though, it's the best part of 200 years ago. But it's still a feature of Anglo-Irish politics to this day. The policy of the UK government in Westminster, the failure of the British state to do enough to intervene. The system of absentee landowners, again, land used for maximum profit rather than for feeding the local population. So that's a classic sort of historic example. In the 20th century, famine has been one of the biggest, probably the biggest killer of people, even more so than war, although the two are often linked. In the Soviet Union, under Stalin, and this is prior to the Second World War, this is in the early 30s, approximately 7 million died. Again, the causes were complex, but a lot of this was down to dogma. It was down to communist dogma. Basically, compare it perhaps to Zimbabwe and what happened under Robert Mugabe. Similar kind of thing. The people who were farming the land kind of seen as that needed to be eliminated. Particularly what were known as the kulaks, the kulak farmers. Stalin did exactly that. But the result was that agricultural policy, agricultural production, particularly in Ukraine, dropped massively, and 7 million people starved. Very similar thing in China. Under Mao. We don't know how many people died in the Chinese famine under Mao. Again, it's still, the Chinese government is still very secretive about this. Estimates have ranged from 15 million, which is a lot of people, up to possibly as many as 45 million. Again, the real number is probably somewhere in between. But this was, once again, a result of radicalisation, dogma over practicality, and the result was totally disastrous. These were famines created by government. The Bangladeshi famine of 1974, between 1 and 2 million deaths. In that case, the main cause was disaster, flooding. Ethiopia, 1984, that was a combination of drought and civil war. Again, estimated 1 million deaths. We got no true number, we probably never will. Slightly more recently, the Somali famine of the early 1990s, very similar to Ethiopia, a combination of drought and civil war. The famine in Sudan in 1993. North Korean famine. To be honest, that's an ongoing thing, North Korea. But in the period 1994 to 98 alone, a few 100,000 to several million. Again, we don't really know. Obviously, North Korean government is very secretive and isn't going to publish accurate figures. Another Ethiopian famine at the turn of the century. In Congo, of course, we looked at the Congo Wars. We talked about that in week 3. The war obviously killed a lot of people directly, but it also led to a famine which resulted in the deaths of approximately 2.7 million people. The mighty food crisis of 05-06, renewed famine in Somalia in 2011 to 2012. The West African famine, which was quite widespread in 2012, brought about by drought and linked to climate change. The famine in Yemen, of course, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, which is linked to the civil war in Yemen and the blockade of Yemen by Saudi Arabia. The 2017 famine in South Sudan, which was linked to climate change again, ongoing famine in Somalia, famine in Nigeria, which was linked to internal conflict and the Boko Haram insurgency, ongoing famine in Madagascar, which I'm sure you're all aware of the famine in Gaza over the last couple of years, which again obviously is linked to the conflict and the Israeli blockade of Gaza. So these are just some examples. I mean, that's not an exhaustive list. So we can see that there are various causes of famine, war, environmental, climate change, and so on. But also, as we mentioned, simply the effects of world capitalism, and particularly the impact of capitalism on food prices. Particularly food being treated as a commodity and traders speculating on that. So just like oil, just like gold, just like Bitcoin, for example. Once something becomes a commodity, and again, remember the idea of commodification, this is what capitalism does. It kind of takes things which, weren't previously necessarily for-profit things and turns them into a commodity. And once you do that, and once you start giving people the idea that there's money to be made by speculating on the prices of a commodity, then you get peaks and troughs. You get boom and bust. You get bubbles formed. A good example, of course, is around AI right now. The US stock market is arguably, overinflated because of speculation on AI. The thing about bubbles is that they go pop. Now, if the AI bubble goes pop, that just means that, that's significant consequences, economic consequences, don't get me wrong. But with food prices, the problem is that, not something when they go pop, but the opposite thing, when the bubble gets inflated, it obviously jacks up prices for the people least able to afford them. To the speculator, to the trader, it's just a line in a graph. It's maybe something after their bank balance getting bigger, but for consumers, that includes consumers in advanced countries, but particularly people in poor countries where upwards of 50% of their income may be spent on food, even at the best of times. Jacking up the prices has disastrous consequences. And of course, also again, the tendency of for-profit landholders to produce whatever will bring in the best profits, so not necessarily food. So, for example, the conversion of corn into ethanol for biofuels. Why? Because there's more money in biofuels than there is in food, than there is in bread. So why convert it into bread, from the capitalist point of view, why convert it into bread when you can convert it into fuel and make a lot more money out of it? The World Bank, for example, has produced numerous reports, but particularly 2008, following the financial crisis. Food prices spiked because, again, food was kind of investors were looking for somewhere to put their money, and food was kind of seen as a good bet, which caused a massive spike in food prices. So we're talking about basically casino economics. So if we look at the the graph, I mean this is from the Food and Agriculture Organization, which of course is an agency of the UN, as you're probably aware. So we can see, that prices spike, prices dip. The overall trend is obviously upwards, but again, these price spikes are caused. Yes, sometimes they are caused by market forces, by supply and demand forces, but very often it's about speculation. And that's just on kind of market sentiment. Again, much like Bitcoin. Bitcoin's the best example of this. If the price of an asset, it's a feeling that the price of an asset, a commodity, is going to increase, then people pile in, and that's what creates a bubble, shoves the price up, potentially with disastrous consequences. So what can governments do about it? Well, obviously governments can try to provide safety nets, social protection, cash transfers. Again, depends on the government, of course. Do they have the means to do this? Things like direct feeding programs, so in schools, for example, or food vouchers for the public food distribution systems. But also governments can attempt to control prices, sometimes by direct intervention, like setting price caps, but also doing things like having grain reserves and so on, so that we can release those into the market to drive down prices. And again, it depends on how much room for manoeuvre the government actually has, of course, because again, this is where you get the effects of we've talked before about institutions like the IMF. So government might be doing these things, but it's the government then runs into problems. Facing a sovereign debt crisis, can't pay its bill. Then along comes the good old IMF and says, right, we'll bail you out, but you have to implement strict Washington consensus policies. What does that mean? Well, it means getting rid of all this stuff. You can't afford that. You can't afford public spending. You can't afford to. We definitely don't want you interfering with the market. You have to side up to free market economics. That's what the IMF Bible tells you to do. So all of these price controls, the IMF orders you to stop doing it. And if you're a government facing a sovereign debt crisis, you really don't have any choice. So how much freedom, how much room for manoeuvre do the governments actually have? At the international level, yes, there are various initiatives which again are both intergovernmental, through UN agencies and so on, but also the work of NGOs. And of course NGOs do a great deal of very useful work in this area. So one of the key agencies, again we've mentioned before, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the specific remit of the FAO is to defeat hunger. And again, that's been the goal since 1945, but hasn't succeeded yet. Has a budget of around $1 billion per year. That ain't a lot, at global level. The number of people we're talking about, 1 billion ain't a lot. It's not a lot of money at all, But nonetheless, it does, with that money, it does do a lot of useful work in terms of, aid, famine relief, and so on. But often criticised, as with many other, international agencies, UN agencies, for being over bureaucratic, for being inefficient, and perhaps for being too tied up with the interests of big business. So again, it's kind of this neoliberal, economics which kind of creeps in. The World Food Programme, again, set up by the FAO in conjunction with the United Nations. There are other funds as well, like the International Fund for Agricultural Development. So, you know, again, the idea of green revolution, the idea of, you know, mechanisation, use of, you know, things like high yield crops, possibly genetically modified crops to produce higher yields, new fertilisers, pesticides, and so on. Investment in that sort of thing to try to increase agricultural production as an aspect of development. The World Health Organization obviously has, you know, a role to play in terms of promoting good nutrition. But again, you know, if you're on the breadline, you just want food of any kind, really. You're not particularly in a position to worry about, you know, whether it's genetically modified or whether it's been grown with pesticide or so on. You just want cheap food, you know, as much of it as you can get. The World Trade Organization, again, do they help or hinder? In some ways, you know, possibly they hinder with their insistence on, you know, on free markets, which again are arguably part of the problem. The UN Climate Change Fund, so again, obviously linked because of the impacts on agriculture, and also the work of regional organisations as well, like the EU, with Common Agricultural Policy, and similar organisations in other parts of the world. So we talked last week about the Millennium Development Goals, which ran up to 2015, and then the Sustainable Development Goals, which targets to be achieved by 2030. So again, the Millennium Development Goals, first of all, the target was to halve between 1990 and 2015 the proportion of people who suffer from hunger. That wasn't really achieved, although there was some progress after 2009. Global hunger actually peaked in 2009. There was some progress afterwards, but again, you know, you can see from the graph, you know, there was some change between 1990 and 2015. So some progress, yes, but you know, I don't think you can say that goal was really properly achieved. And then onto the Sustainable Development Goals, which again sets targets which, you know, with 5 years, well, less than 5 years now, because we're almost at the end of 2025. So we can say in the next 4 years, these targets are meant to be achieved. By 2030, to end hunger and ensure access by all people to safe, nutritious and sufficient food, and to end all forms of malnutrition. We ain't on target to do that, you know. That's not going to happen in the next 4 years. Double agricultural productivity and incomes of small-scale food producers, again through land reform, among other things. Ensure sustainable food production systems, resilient agricultural practices, genetic diversity of seeds, cultivated plants and animals, increase investment in farming. Correct and prevent trade restrictions and distortions in world agricultural markets. Well, again, how's that working out? And adopt measures to ensure the proper functioning of food commodity markets and their derivatives to help limit extreme food price volatility. Again, I'm not really seeing any progress on that one. So yeah, you know, the international system. You know, there is an international regime, but is it enough? I don't think it is. You know, I think the governance regime around this is very limited in actual fact. I'm not saying it's useless. I'm not saying it doesn't, you know, do some useful things. But you know, the idea that we're going to eliminate hunger by 2030 is, you know, it's not happening. So again, NGOs, you know, work to help to fill the gap in some cases. So Action Against Hunger is just one. There are many organisations. And again, they do all sorts of stuff from, emergency sort of food distribution in disaster zones, longer term security initiatives, and so on. We've mentioned the World Food Programme, which again is actually a UN initiative, but works with NGOs. Mentioned Action Against Hunger, various others. These are just a few examples of non-profit organisations which, exist to provide food aid. Perhaps the most famous one, none of you will remember this. I mean, I was only a young kid at the time, but I do remember it. Was the Live Aid movement in 1985. So again, this was about some of the most the most high-profile people and bands in the music industry kind of coming together to put on this huge concert to promote aid, particularly for Ethiopia. It was at the height of the Ethiopian famine. And again, I was only a small kid myself at this time, but I still remember every night you turn on the TV and getting images of these starving kids. And again, awareness, I think, was in the West was raised, by the widespread sort of availability of colour TV from the 1960s, 1970s into the 1980s. For the first time, people were seeing this footage, and there was, a strong shift in public opinion. And again, I think what the sort of Live Aid movement achieved was to raise awareness. I mean, yes, it did raise quite a lot of funding directly, and did a lot of good work. But I think more importantly, it kind of, helped to put the issue in the public consciousness in the UK and beyond. So again, that's 40 years ago now, but still kind of stands out as kind of a landmark movement. Did it do enough? Obviously not, because 40 years on, obviously hunger is still a huge problem. But at least I think it was kind of a landmark event which did help to raise public consciousness. So again, part of the problem is population growth. We mentioned this last week when we were talking about water. So once again, human population has skyrocketed, in recent years. So, up until less than, 500 years ago. In fact, we're only talking really 200 years ago, just over 200 years ago, when the global population crossed 1 billion. Most of human history, we're talking maybe a quarter, maybe a third of a billion people. That was the global population. And it's only really since the Industrial Revolution that population has skyrocketed. Now again, agricultural productivity has also skyrocketed. There was a guy called Thomas Malthus in the early modern period, and you come across this term Malthusian crisis, because even then Malthus was kind of seeing the trend of increasing population and said that eventually we are going to hit a ceiling where food production is not going to be able to match rising population. Now we haven't actually hit that, again because of rising productivity, because we are able to produce much more food. So once again, the problem at the moment is not that we don't have enough food, it's the distribution of the food. Nonetheless, rising population is putting pressure on food supplies. And as I've said before, we cannot continue to see human population increase. I mean, that only goes up to 2,000. We're now well north of 8 billion, and projections are something like 12 billion, possibly by the end of the century. So, 9.5 billion by 2075. And again, the biggest areas of population, the areas which are seeing the biggest population increase are also the regions which are seeing, are affected by food poverty, and particularly Africa. Africa's population is increasing rapidly. So this is an issue. Ultimately, with finite resources, finite farmland, we cannot infinitely increase human population. Again, increasing productivity can help, and that's kind of part of the plan. Food production currently utilises about half of usable land, so it is possible to appropriate more land for food production. But again, that then comes into conflict with other potential uses for land, like biofuel production, which may be a bigger thing in the future as fossil fuels start to run out. Water, again, directly linked to last week's topic. You can't irrigate the land if you don't have a sufficient water supply. And we looked at the constraints last week on water supply. And also energy. Again, particularly, industrialised agriculture and mechanised agriculture requires large amounts of energy. So again, direct links to energy security, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago. Urbanisation. Again, we've mentioned, by 2050, maybe 2/3 of the world's population is projected to live in urban areas, which is a profound shift, because for most of human history, not prior to 5, 6, 7,000 years ago, humans were all hunter-gatherers. But in the last few thousand years, we've been mostly farmers. It's been mostly a rural world. It's changing, and we're now shifting to a situation where the majority of the world's population is going to be urban. So again, think about urban food security. How do you get food into cities when you have massive concentrations of millions of people in one place? How do you supply them? And again, urban agriculture is. I don't think this is all of the solution, but I think it can help. If we look around Leeds, for example, there's a lot of space which potentially could be used to produce crops. Even at the top of buildings, potentially could be used to produce crops. So fitting agriculture in around built-up areas. I'll mention quickly, I'm not going to spend much time on this because we're running short of time, but I'll mention quickly a couple of examples of initiatives to improve food security. So one is the EU Common Agricultural Policy. So up until the early 1960s, food shortage was a big thing in Europe. Following the Second World War, it took until the 60s really to recover. So the EU, of course it wasn't the EU then, it was the European Economic Community at that time, but among EEC as it was member states, later EU member states, systems were set up to provide subsidies to farmers, guaranteed food prices and so on, basically intervention in the market. Today this is kind of one of the biggest sections of the EU's budget. Does it work? Well, yes. The EU has gone from a situation in the 1960s of not having enough food to having abundance. The idea of food mountains, and again, this is now a political issue because there's kind of controversies about farmers being paid to produce nothing because the EU has so much food that it's actually paying farmers not to produce. I guess it's a good problem to have too much food compared to the situation that, the rest of the world is in. Mentioned the Green Revolution. So again, developments in agriculture, so everything from genetically modified crops, but also, the use of mechanisation, the use of pesticides, the use of fertilisers and so on. Does it increase production? Yes, it does. But of course, it brings with it other problems, other dangers. Chemical pesticides, not necessarily the best thing for human health, especially when they're getting washed into the watercourses and into the reservoirs. We're not only eating them in the food, we're actually drinking them through our drinking water as well. Not necessarily the best thing for human health either. The same thing with GM food, of course. You know, do we know how safe this is in the long term? And we don't really. And again, there's also the problem that the poorest nations can't afford this stuff. You know, not without investment from abroad. Again, lots of new developments, technological developments. You know, use of drones and you know the idea of alternative protein like insect protein and so on. Lab-grown meat, I don't think is the solution really. Plant-based proteins. You know. Lots of potential for technical innovation, but again we have to also think about the quality of the food, and that's the problem. You know, science might be able to produce greater quantity, but what's the quality like? You know, and are the kind of issues there that impact directly on public health security, again, which is next week. So again, we have to think about the ethics, the idea of food justice. You know, inequality in access, which we've talked a lot about, distribution versus production. Is food a human right? You know, and again, if we're talking about second-generation human rights, then it's pretty widely recognised that yes, it's one of the obviously the basic requirements for human life. But if it is a right, then who fulfils that right? Whose duty is it? The government? And if the government can't or won't, then what role does the international community have to play? And is the international community doing enough? Again, we can define, to summarise all of that, we can define food security as access for all people at all times to sufficient, safe and nutritious food, food poverty, limited access to quality food, undernourishment, intake below minimum energy needs. So, as we've said, we can look at it through a traditional security lens, we can look at it through a human security lens. We've talked about some of the drivers of food insecurity, some of the causes of famine. We've mentioned over-reliance on single crops, export-driven agriculture, the effects of global capitalism, in terms of land ownership, in terms of market distortion and so on. We've mentioned the effects of conflict and war, state failure and so on, natural disasters, again, some of which are maybe not all that natural, because if we talk about climate change, we're talking about human-influenced issues, floods, droughts and so on. Government mismanagement and the effects of global capitalism. We've mentioned the future threats, particularly of population growth, pressure on land, pressure on available water, pressure on available energy. We've mentioned climate change. So again, there are stormy seas ahead, I think. But once again, returning to this, and again, I know I've made this point numerous times, but I think it's a very important point to raise. That at the moment, despite all of this, at the moment we do produce enough food to nourish the global population, and yet 5 million kids starve to death every year. Why? Because of political choices. It comes down to the failures of the political system, whether we look at that at the international level or the national level. And we can, we can discuss what aspects of the political system are failing. Is it the state? Is it the nature of the Westphalian state system? Is it the inadequate nature of global governance? The inadequate nature of multilateralism? Is it to do with realist thinking? Is it to do with selfishness, national interest thinking? I'm all right, we're all right. Not a problem if someone, in another part of the world is starved. But again, it may be our problem. Certainly in your lifetimes, it may be our problem. We may be feeling comfortable now, but the UK is headed for, I think, it's headed for turbulent times. And some of this stuff might start to touch us in ways that it hasn't for generations. My grandparents knew about food poverty. My my granddad and you know, his sort of relatives talking about growing up in the 1920s. They knew about food poverty, you know, but for, you know, the last, you know, 70, 80 years, it's not really been a problem for us, but the time may be coming when it is. So yeah, think about, you know, ultimately about unequal power structures, you know, weak governments, effects of global capitalism, market distortions and so on. You know, these are the real barriers to food security as things currently stand. You know, hunger ultimately is a political problem. It's not a technical problem, it's a political problem. And solutions ultimately have to be political. But as we know, as Einstein said, you know, politics is more difficult than physics. Okay, so we're pretty much out of time. So if anyone has any questions, say hello to the seminar.